The national grid has remained one of the most topical issues in Nigeria due to its consistent rise and fall. Why is the biggest black nation on earth, the largest economy on the African continent, and the largest black democracy unable to fix her electricity system? Well, we'll be focusing on that on this episode of the program. My name is Leah Katung-Babatunde and I invite you to sail along with me. And as always, we begin the business of the day from the trends table. The federal government, through the Office of the Accountant General of the Federation, is enumerating legacy assets to boost her account valuation that currently stands at 39 trillion naira in liabilities. Accountant General of the Federation, Oluwatoyin Madin, said systematically cataloging and valuing legacy assets that have often been overlooked by ministries, departments, and agencies can unlock substantial value to the nation's finances, emphasizing that our office will initiate measures to enforce compliance and sanctions will be applied to non-complying MDAs.
It is expected that after this workshop, they will all go back and submit their inventory of assets, which will be evaluated and placed in the financial statement on or before 31st December 2024.
The federal government has commenced a disbursement of 75 billion naira single-digit loans to micro, small and medium enterprises (MSMEs) through the Bank of Industry. Tola Adekunle Johnson, the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Job Creation and MSMEs, made this known in Abuja at a nationwide town hall meeting to sensitize MSMEs to the Presidential Grant and Loan Scheme. He explained that MSMEs can walk into any bank of industry and apply for the single-digit loan at 9% interest rate for up to 1 million naira. Earlier, the managing director of the bank, Olasupo Lucy, represented by Mabel Ndagi, Executive Director, Public Sector and Interventions of the bank, explained that the intervention fund was established to support MSMEs towards driving economic growth and job creation. The Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission (FCCPC) has urged electricity distribution companies (DISCOs) to carry energy consumers along before classifying them into bands and also adhere strictly to industry regulations on billing unmetered consumers. FCCPC's Executive Vice Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Tunji Bello, at a stakeholders meeting in Abuja, cited non-compliance with the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission next order and directed Ikeja Electricity Distribution Company and Eko Electricity Distribution Company to immediately halt their replacement of Unistar prepaid meters. To prevent potential exploitation, FCCPC has directed that all meter replacement processes be conducted transparently with costs borne by the DISCOs and not passed on to consumers. Electricity distribution companies DISCOs in Nigeria have announced revised price for various electricity meter models, marking the second price hike in 4 months. With this development, the cost of a single-phase meter has risen from approximately 117,000 naira to as much as 149,800 naira, depending on the distribution company and meter vendor. The new prices reflect the deregulation of meter access providers (MAP) as directed by the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission (NEC). How viable is Nigeria's electricity plan and what is the place of the nation's grid? Well, here's that conversation with Engineer Daudu Abdul Aziz. About 10 weeks ago, the federal government unveiled the zero draft of the National Integrated Electricity Policy and Strategic Implementation Plan. Now, primarily, it is to address the pressing challenges within the Nigerian electricity supply industry and set the nation towards a robust, inclusive, and sustainable power sector. Now, Engineer Daudu Abdul Aziz is the CEO Optimal Power and Energy Solutions, a power and energy services company right here in Abuja, the nation's capital. And this is, of course, after serving across multiple platforms in the power sector. He's listed in ESI Africa's 60 most influential figures in East and West Africa, and he joins me to examine the current challenges of electricity market in the country. It's nice to have you, sir, join me for this conversation.
Thank you, Leah, for inviting me.
While we're preparing for this conversation, the national grid collapsed again. And so I'm wondering, what is the matter with our grid?
The issue with the national grid itself, I think to have a full understanding of the issues involved, we need to understand how the grid dynamics operate. Now, of course, we have had system collapse, and by a comedy of errors, we had prolonged outage times, especially in the northern part of the country, due to destruction of some power lines. If you look at the national grid in its steady state, it maintains a balance between generation and load, between supply and demand. And the National Control Center keeps close watch on that balance by keeping a watch on the frequency, on deviations from the nominal value of 50 hertz, which will tell you whether there is too much supply in the network or the load is too much. If there's a balance, then the frequency will be 15 hertz and supply will be normal. Everybody will have quality supply. When there is a large disturbance in the network, by large disturbance I mean a big chunk of load connected to the grid or a generating unit tripping, that will automatically trigger automatic controls that will adjust the output of generators to restore the system to stability, to normalcy. Now, where you don't have adequate spinning reserve, by spinning reserve we mean generators that are connected in the network but not fully loaded, which can be called upon to compensate for mismatches in supply and demand. So where you don't have adequate reserves, of course, the inevitable thing that will happen is a complete shutdown of the system, which is what we call system collapse. So system collapse is actually a total shutdown of the system, the national grid. All the power plants, generating units will shut down, transmission lines will trip, and the system will come to zero, which is as a result of the inability of the generation capacity to supply the load at a particular time. So that is what has been happening. So the question is, why have we been having so many collapses? The reason is simply because we do not have adequate generation capacity to supply the load. And this has been going on for a very long time, and the obvious reason is simply because we have not been faithful in implementing our power system development plans. Plans are there, quite all right. But in terms of implementation, that is where we are lacking. If you are targeting a demand of, say, 5,000 megawatts in the next 5 years, you start building for that capacity today. But if you don't start or you have any lapse in between, it may take you maybe 10 years to complete this project. And by the time you finish the project, you are not meeting the demand of that 10 years. You are meeting the demand of the previous 5 years that you started.
Do you think it's time to decentralize the national grid?
I'm not one of those who believe in that as a solution. I think the solution is to have one grid, reinforced national grid. So all the things and the shortcomings we have identified should be corrected. You need to expand the network. The network is presently radial. If you had other lines coming to the north, you don't have this problem. So of course, if you compare what we're having today with what obtained, let's say, 15, 20 years ago, there has been some significant improvement in the transmission network, because hitherto you only had two lines coming from Jeba to Shiroro to Kaduna, and from Kaduna you supply Kano, Jos, from Jos you extend supply to Gombe and on to Maiduguri, and that was the only route until around 2002, 2005, when another line was constructed from Shiroro to Abuja. Abuja, before that time, was being fed from a 132 kV line. And with the growth of Abuja, of course, 132 kV was not enough. It was not until 2017, actually, before we had the second opening from, it used to be called New Haven, Enugu. That project had been on since the early 90s. But because of budgetary challenges and so on, it stayed on until it was taken over by the NIPP and completed in 2017. And that's when we had this second channel to Jos from that sector, from that portion of the grid. The building of Geregu Power Station in Kogi State has opened the opportunity to connect Geregu to Lokoja and Abuja here. And of course, Ajakuta, where Geregu is located, had already been connected to the national grid from Benin. So already you had that route. So the only thing now is probably to extend the connection to Kaduna from Abuja so that you have another route. In effect, you are going to have the normal two lines from Shiroro to Kaduna. If you have another two lines from Abuja to Kaduna, with the one that is coming to Jos from Ugwaji now, Ugwaji Makurdi, Kaduna, at least you have better flexibility in closing that gap.
We are not generating enough power, is that correct?
No, not that we are not generating enough power. Even if you are generating enough power, you cannot discount grid collapse. It's just part of the electrical system. Faults can develop. For instance, now, suppose you are supplying the needed power for the load, for the economy, for the consumers. Let's say even 10,000 megawatts is being supplied. And second, suddenly, the transmission line develops a fault and trips. That can cause system collapse. Or a big generator somewhere, a big generating unit that is carrying a lot of power, trips, and you don't have enough reserve to compensate for it in real time, you are going to have system collapse. So trying to have secure power supply, stable power supply requires much more than having generation capacity. It also requires having system flexibility in terms of transmission lines, in terms of adequate reserves, in terms of control equipment, in terms of even monitoring equipment. And that's why I talked about coordinated planning and resource management. You understand? So we have to make sure that the power system is operated and maintained with the needed investment. Of course, all these things call for investment, adequate investment at any given time. You must have adequate capacity, generation capacity, to supply the load. The other things about controls, flexibility, these are important, for system reliability. For instance, now if you have limited number of transmission lines, it doesn't mean that the whole country should be in darkness. It only means that some section will be suffering, but some other section will be having power supply. But reliability is when you make sure that whatever contingency happens, it doesn't affect availability of power supply. So all these contingencies are taken into consideration whenever you are planning your system to make sure that you have adequate power supply and reliable power supply all the time. So it's not only generation capacity, but knowing where we came from, we are coming from a situation when really the country was in dire straits in terms of generation capacity. If you take your mind back to, let's say, the year 2000, what was the generation capacity? It was maybe 1,900 megawatts. Here in Abuja, we had to resort to emergency power to power the federal capital. You can remember geometric power, Agreco. As you are coming into Abuja by Katampe, you will be seeing all these drums of diesel and so on. In a day, we could have 10 system collapses at that time. But people didn't know that the situation was so bad because the generation capacity was so bad, and even the network was so limited in terms of capacity to transmit power. And that was why we had that problem. So the government was forced to come in to provide emergency solutions. That's when you had all these three stations, Olorin Shogo, Geregu, Omotosho. They were built in a hurry just to bridge that gap, you know. And then later NIPP came, the NIPP projects came to build more power stations, expand the network, you know, improve supply availability. But what we don't sometimes appreciate is that power projects have long gestation times. So you have a big problem now, and you start to build projects to address those problems. Those projects have to mature, and it takes time for them to mature. So, but the important thing is, when you start to address a problem by providing emergency solutions, then you should kick on with the real plan for meeting the demands of the future, so that you don't have this problem again.
Now, with what happened recently, the 10 days of darkness in the north, it has thrown open the question of securing critical infrastructure. In the past, we were always talking about vandals, but now we're seeing that it has assumed another dimension. Is it something that can be handled in the short term, or is something that the security agencies will have to actively play a role in it?
The fundamental requirement for any nation to survive is to have security. If you don't have security, there is nothing that can be done. If you have security, even if you want to execute development projects, you cannot. You understand? So I think the government has to take the issue of security very seriously. Like you said, in the 1990s, I think the problem of vandalism was restricted to oil installations. Now, thankfully, that has been somehow resolved. Now we have this threat of insecurity, and it has widened to cover all aspects of our lives, now including economic infrastructure like power lines and so on. So I think it is something that the government has to deal decisively with. I believe the government is capable of dealing with it if they put their mind to it, because the economy and the survival of the country is at stake.
If you're going to provide a solution to this problem we now have in our hands, what will it be?
One good thing about Nigeria, you know, we are not short of plans. Where we are lacking is really implementation. Now, in the last 5 years, there has been a very good document prepared by TCN. It's called Transmission Rehabilitation and Expansion Plan. The term transmission is there, but if you look at it holistically, it also encompasses generation and a bit of even distribution. That plan is a very well laid out plan. The plan was unveiled, I think, in 2017. Now we are in 2024. We are still with the target of 2020, which is 13,000 megawatts. Because the generation capacity in the system now is around 13,000, 14,000 megawatts. But if you look at transmission, there have been key and vital transmission line projects that were part of that plan, which have not been either completed or even started. Critical transmission lines, which would really solve a lot of problems. Now, in terms of investment for generation, of course, since privatization, of course, generation is to be financed from private investments. So I think the role, for instance, the role that the Electricity Regulatory Commission will do normally is to say, if you want to add, let's say, 10,000 megawatts in the next 5 years, what the NERC will do now is to license any private person that is going to build power plants. Up to that, different people. Of course, government is responsible for building the large hydros. We talk about the Mambila project, for instance, which has been, unfortunately, still on the drawing board. Zungeru has finally been completed. But in terms of maybe the thermal capacity, that's open to private investments. Now, the other thing that I see is the importance of integrating renewable energy. What the government is doing now in terms of renewable energy is the investment in building large hydros, which of course is renewable energy. But things like utility scale solar, other small hydros and so on, satisfying the demand for power is something that you don't say, let me rely on A source of energy or B. Thankfully, Nigeria has almost everything. Presently, our energy is supplied largely from thermal plants. The thermal plants produce 80% of the Nigerian energy requirements, while hydros provide 20%. Most of the off-grid penetration of solar power is not on record, but people still continue to talk about solar as if there is no solar. So if you aggregate all those, we are using solar so much. But the focus should be to utilize all available sources of energy, solar, wind, and the fossil fuels we are extracting. Coal has been disused since the last power station, Oji River. But there are large concentrations of coal deposits in various parts. Those ones can be exploited. My prescription will be to be pragmatic, utilize all sources of energy available to generate the required power, make a lot of investment in renewable energy, and expand the transmission network. We have not reached the stage where people will say we sectionalize the grid. It boils down to a lot of misunderstanding, because people maybe read what is happening in other places like the United States or even there, they have one single grid. And in each region of the grid, they have a lot of generation capacity that can sustain that system. Now, if, for instance, now you break Nigeria into 10 regions and say they are regional grids, look at that portion of northern Nigeria, that if it's going to be a regional grid, where is the power supply going to come? And naturally, in terms of electricity production, the resources for energy generation are not evenly distributed. You find them concentrated in certain parts. Like all the gas resources are in certain parts of the country. Hydros are in pockets of the northern part of the country. And the load centers are evenly spread, scattered all over. In terms of reliability of power supply, is to site the power plant at the center of gravity of the load. But it's not practicable. So you put your generation plants where you have the resources, and then use transmission lines to transport them. The grid we have now, I'm talking about architecture now, not the capacity of the grid. The architecture of the grid is adequate as a model for Nigeria. What we need now is to reinforce it. Where you have single lines, add double lines. Where you have ring circuits, close the loops so that you can channel power through other routes when the given route is out, either on fault or for any other reason. Yeah.
Master Sari, thank you, sir, for making time for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Simplify this is next, and we head to the markets from there. For more on rates from markets across the country, do well to log on to our sister website. It is www.marketnigeriatv.com. We have all the details and more there for you. And don't forget, until we come your way again, same time next week, do well to log on to our various social media platforms and follow us on YouTube. Leave your comments, questions, and suggestions because we value them to help us serve you better. Now, a working Nigeria rests in the hand of all citizens, so play your part. God bless Nigeria.